Today we're going to be talking about the ethics of Confucius. I always begin courses in philosophy, and especially in ethics, by talking about Confucius, not only because he gives us a view, very much like Aristotle's, but almost 200 years in advance of Aristotle, but also because he lays out very, very clearly what the basic problems of ethics are. And so he raises the right kinds of questions, and he gives us a theory about each one. It has become commonplace in more contemporary versions of ethics to take one question as fundamental. He doesn't do that. He takes a variety of questions as fundamental and then explores their relationships. So, here are three questions that are fundamental not just to ethical thinking in China, but to ethics anywhere, to ethics itself. The first one, what should I do? That's a question primarily about action. What should I do in a given situation? In general, how do I face problems of action? Secondly, what kind of person should I be? That's primarily a question of character. What should I be like? What kind of character should I strive to develop? What kind of person should I be? What is a good person anyway? The first question deals with questions of right and wrong. The second with the question of what it is to be a good person or a bad person. And finally, how do I decide? I have to decide about actions all the time. How do I go about making those decisions? What kinds of reasons are legitimate reasons for action? Those questions are intimately connected. We tend to think that good people do good things and for the right reason. And so they're very similar questions. On the other hand, they aren't the same question. And so Confucius is careful to distinguish them. And there are three different parts of the theory that answer those three different questions. I think it's very hard to understand what's going on in the analects unless you see that there are these three questions and three different kinds of theory are being proposed as solutions to them. So the first one, the question, what should I do? His answer is li in the Chinese. That's often translated as the rules of propriety. And that's a matter of following certain social rules. Behaving appropriately, in other words. And we'll talk a lot more about each of these in a moment. The second one, what kind of person should I be? His answer to that can be summarized in another Chinese term, ren. I am to be a virtuous person. And there he gives us a theory of virtue. And finally, how do I decide? We can encapsulate his answer in one word, yi, often translated as righteousness or justice. And what it comes down to is deciding for the right reasons, making decisions on the basis of the considerations that superior person would use. Now, often people approach these questions, and in fact in the West, they approach these questions most often by treating one of them as fundamental and then analyzing the others in terms of it. So for example, in much of ancient ethics, you find this sort of analysis. What kind of person I ought to be determines what I ought to do. What should I do? Oh, that's an easy question. Do whatever a virtuous person would do. How do I decide? Oh, that's easy. Decide on the basis of the reasons or the considerations that a virtuous person would take into account. And so, from that point of view, a lot of ancient thinkers, including Plato and Aristotle, I think, start with the question of what kind of person I ought to be, and then treat the others as simple. Just do the kind of thing that a virtuous person would do. Act on the basis of the reasons that a virtuous person would take into account. Often in modern ethics, the question of what I should do is taken as fundamental, and then the others are treated as just derivative from that. What kind of person should I be? The kind of person who does what he ought to do. How should I decide? I should decide on the basis of whatever leads me reliably to the right answer about what I should do. And so we're going to come back to those kinds of strategies, but it's important to notice that in Confucius, he doesn't do that. There are three separate questions here, and one isn't simply reduced to the others. So, from his point of view, they're all important questions, but they're all independent. You can't just say, to be virtuous is to do the right thing reliably. Or, what is it to do the right thing? It's just to do what a virtuous person would do. These three components of ethics are independent components. They interact in important ways, but nevertheless, they're different components. So, here are the key concepts that Confucius uses. The first one, ren. I tend to translate that as virtue. Sometimes it's translated as benevolence. It's really the answer to the question, what I ought to be. The second, li, propriety. It's a question of what I ought to do. And the most important principle under that heading is the principle of zhong. altruism or likening to oneself, which is what you wouldn't want done to you, don't do to others. Then, yi, righteousness or justice, how I decide, why I do it, is the answer to that. It's the answer to that question. And then finally, a key concept is the Tao, which here is strictly an ethical concept. It's the path, the right way to live. So the Tao here we're going to look at in a very different context within Taoism, but here it just means the path, the right way to live. So the person who follows the Tao here is just the person who lives the right way. Well, you can see how these match up with some of the questions we've raised. What kind of person should I be? A virtuous one. What should I do? I should act appropriately. And then how should I decide? I should decide on the basis of the right kinds of considerations. And we'll have a theory about what each of those involves. Well, that's then actually I've already said this, there are three different components to a moral theory. We're going to have a theory of virtue, a set of principles about what to do, and then a theory of decisions or reasons. And those are things that we'll see in every theory we encounter in ethics all the way through the course. We're trying to deal with the practical side of philosophy, and so that's really something we can ask about at the level of character, at the level of individual action, and then the level of basically having a process in mind by which we reach decisions in particular cases. Okay. Well, all of that is about the general shape of the theory. There is something really important I need to tell you, however, about the kind of answer Confucius gives. Confucius rose from poverty to really become the most influential figure in the history of China. He quit his job and started his own school when he was 22. At some points he had as many as 3,000 students at a time. And for more than 1,000 years, Chinese civil service exams were based on the 4 books of Confucius. Now, they talk about a lot of things, but there are certain things that Confucius does not discuss. So in particular, he is a humanist. He does at certain points refer to the mandate of heaven, as if this entire ethical structure rests in some way on something that goes beyond the observable world. On the other hand, he doesn't really talk about that. He doesn't think it's possible to talk about that. Qi Lu. There are a number of people who interact with Confucius in the Analects. Confucius himself wrote nothing, but the Analects are sayings that are meant to reflect things he said, often in conversation with others. And here, one of these other people, Qi Lu, asked about serving the spirits. The master, Confucius, said, "If you can't serve men, how can you serve spirits?" Qi Lu added, "I venture to ask about death." Confucius answered, "If you don't know about life, how can you ask about death?" So there is no way to really know anything beyond the bounds of experience. This is why I've listed Confucius under the generally empiricist heading of this course. He says, look, I know what I know on the basis of life around me. All of that may rest on some other foundation, but that's not something I feel that I'm in a position to talk about. So we're going to talk about the things we can talk about strictly on the basis of human experience. And another point, the master said the value of the way depends on man. The value of man doesn't depend on the way. The way here again, the Tao, the right way to live. And so ethics is something that arises out of human life. It's meant to be an answer to questions about human life. It's not something superimposed on. Now there's something else that's interesting here. It's not just that he won't talk about something that goes beyond ordinary human affairs. He also won't talk about human nature itself, independently of the way people actually tend to act and behave. He denies that he has any theory of human nature. Zikong said, we may hear the master on letters and culture, but we may not hear him on human nature and the way of heaven. So he won't talk about the way of heaven, he won't talk about the things beyond this world, but also he won't talk about human nature. He says everything I'm saying is independent of any particular conception of what it is to be a human being. And so, similarly, he speaks about what we can affect, what arises from nurture, you might say, from the contributions of people to one another. He declines to speak of human nature itself. Now, can you really do that? Is it possible to talk about what kind of person you want to be and what you want to do independently of what people are like? Suppose people are nasty, okay? Suppose we have a Thomas Hobbes type situation where, if people were left to their own devices, they would do terrible things. life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Does that have any implications for what we ought to do? Suppose you look around this room and everybody else is like a ravening wolf, okay? Like an animal about to get you at any time. Yeah?
You would only for yourself.
Yeah, you might look out only for yourself, and you might think the best thing for me to do is protect myself. So the first thing I have to do before I think about anything else is protecting myself. On the other hand, suppose everybody's actually really nice. Sometimes people do bad things, but at the core of our being is something good, something beautiful, okay? And that really inside we're all flower children who would just love to sit around and sing Kumbaya and be happy and pat each other on the head. Would that have implications about how you ought to live? Sure, right? Now, most followers of Confucius within the Confucian tradition have said, yeah, wait a minute, I don't think you can get away with this. I think it matters a lot what the character of human nature is. Before I can tell you what kind of person to be or how you want to behave, I need to know, are other people basically good or are they basically evil? And so Confucius says, look, I'm trying to give you a theory independent of anything like that. But many Confucians later felt compelled to give a theory of human nature. They thought, look, I can't really answer these questions well unless I know, are people basically good? Are people basically evil? So the most influential follower of Confucius, Meneses, says people are naturally good. And we'll look at his arguments for this position in a moment. He says, look, inside we're all basically good. Now that good tendency of ours can be distorted or it can be developed. And so it's not as if everybody actually behaves in the right way all the time. But still, if we just do what comes naturally, we'll be doing something good. Shunzi says exactly the opposite. People are naturally evil, but we have to be taught to be good. And that, he thinks, has important implications. If we just did what came naturally, we'd all be selfish beasts, Shunzi thinks. And so that tells us we really have to develop, and we have to restrain human nature. Whereas Meneses basically says, no, we just have to liberate and develop human nature. Wang Chung later, who is explicitly empiricist in his approach, by the way, says, well, look, they're both sort of right. Some people are basically good and some people are basically evil. And so you can't really generalize. Some people are naturally good, other people aren't. Look at babies. Some babies, like me, they're just good babies, right? When I was a baby, I just played around happily. I never really caused much of a fuss. Luckily, both of my own children were like that too. They were really super easy babies to take care of. My brother wasn't like that at all. He was, as a baby at any rate, naturally evil. I mean, he was born and for about 8 months did nothing but scream. I should say, by the way, since I'm filming this, it's turned out to be very successful for him. He's a bank vice president and doing extremely well. But anyway, you might say, look, people are just different. Some people are naturally good, some people are naturally bad. Some people need a lot more education and training, others you can more or less let go on their own. And then finally, Xu, a Neo-Confucian from the medieval period, says, look, we all have a good nature and an evil nature inside of us. We have what he calls the moral mind versus the natural mind. The natural mind is like Shunzi's conception of human nature. It's basically selfish. But the moral mind, conscience, is also innate in us. And it's, as Meneses said, it drives us for the good. And so we really have the battle between an angel and a devil inside every single one of us, he thinks. But my point for now is really mostly just to say, notice that all of these followers of Confucius felt that they had to fill in what is a blank in Confucius, to say something about what human nature really is like. Now, they did give some reasons. So Meneses, for example, who lived about 200 years after Confucius, says, virtue is innate. It is based on feelings. We are all naturally good. We all have a natural conception of virtue. And why? Because we all naturally have, or almost all anyway, have natural feelings that lead us toward the good. He says, all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. Okay? So everyone actually has these natural feelings about basically recoiling from suffering, thinking of suffering as bad, even if it's not your own suffering. We don't enjoy the thought of other people's suffering. And here's his main argument, the main example. If people suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will without exception experience a feeling of alarm and distress. Now, think about that. You're in a backyard picnic, and in this backyard, there's a well, okay? And people have been doing some work on it, let's say. It's not well protected. Somebody could just fall right into it. And a little toddler is going around, enjoying himself on a picnic, and starts walking toward the well, toward this hole, right? And you see the child going toward the well. What do? You stop the child, right? Or you shout and try to get somebody closer to help. You do something about it, right? You don't just sit there and go, hey, he's going to die. Okay? And Meneses says that indicates that there is something natural in you. In fact, if the baby falls in, what's your reaction? It's not really the Nelson Muntz sort of, Instead, you're going to be very upset. And so that tells us there's something naturally good in us, that these feelings are really innate, and at least almost universal. So he says, feelings like that, feeling of pity, of a concern for the welfare of others, that's essential to us. Feelings of shame and dislike are also essential to us, he says. Feelings of modesty are essential to us. So are feelings of approving and disapproving certain things. We react to certain things naturally, as well, with a feeling of pleasure or a feeling of displeasure, depending on the nature of the act. And that tells us there's something like a moral sense that really is innate in us. So he says, people are actually naturally good. We have these basic things, and those feelings that are innate in us lead to things like a conception of virtue, red, or a conception of what is a proper thing to think about in behavior. That's what comes from shame and dislike, yi. Or the rules of propriety, which come from a sense of modesty and complacence. In other words, really a feeling of what's appropriate behavior in a certain situation. And then approving and disapproving, this in general is the foundation for our knowledge of moral questions. How do we know what's right and wrong, good and bad? Well, we have feelings of approval and disapproval that tell us. And so in each case, Meneses says, there is something innate and basic in us that leads us to know something about what is the right thing to do and what's the right sort of person to be. There are in Meneses a number of other things that seem to me really worth noting. And so this is, in particular, my favorite passage. I quote this to people all the time. You might think, what kind of friend are you? You constantly say that. But anyway, there's a tendency in people to blame others or blame circumstances for their failures. And Meneses will have none of it. He says, look, if it didn't work, look for the error within yourself. The man who would be benevolent. So the person who wants to be virtuous, in other words, is like the archer. The archer adjusts himself and then shoots. If he misses, he doesn't murmur against those who surpass himself. He simply turns around and seeks the cause of his failure in himself. Okay, so if you don't get what you want, if you end up failing at something, think, what did I do wrong? How could I do it better? You can blame other circumstances. The archer can blame the wind, can say, well, the target was moving too fast, or, I couldn't see very well, it was a very humid day, or there were branches in the way, or you can blame all sorts of things on your failure. But in the end, Meneses says, look, you want to succeed, figure out how to overcome those obstacles. We all face obstacles in life. Don't blame the obstacles. Instead, think, how can I overcome them? And if at first you don't overcome them, figure out what you're doing wrong and get better. For years, I kept an issue of Forbes magazine on my shelf that was just entitled, Failure, Why It's So Damn Good For You. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually a very hopeful message. And it's really what Meneses is saying. How do you get better? You fail, and then you figure out why you failed. You find the errors within yourself, and you correct them, and you do better next time. It's not as if, sometimes you're going to face easier situations than others. But the point isn't to find the easy situations and succeed in them. The point is to figure out how to overcome the difficulties. Unfortunately, my cats tore up that issue of Forbes magazine, so I no longer have it. I failed to keep it safe from the cats. But still, I have Meneses saying the same thing, okay? Look for the cause of error within yourself. There are a number of other things that he thinks follow importantly from this idea that we are basically good. He says the path of duty lies in what is near. People seek for it in what is remote. The work of duty lies in what's easy. And so virtue, he says, look, it's close to you. It's actually easy to achieve. It is not something that requires years of dedicated training, as Confucius. And Shunzi thought, it's not that hard to be a good person, Meneses is saying. Just do what comes naturally to you. He said the great man is he who does not lose his child's heart. In other words, you know even as a child what right and wrong are. Stay with that. Retain that. Don't let the world befog your mind and make it so cloudy that you can no longer see these truths you knew as a small child. Now, what are some basic moral truths that even a small child knows, but that adults can forget? Through Even's desire, through confusion, through the complication of adult life, what are some basic truths that you know as a child that you're in danger of losing? Yeah?
Don't lie.
Good, don't lie. Okay, that's something that every child knows. And yet, as an adult, it becomes so easy to justify a lie, right? It starts with the lie that is actually helpful. The girlfriend who says, does this make me look fat? Or the, the guy who says, you think I handled that pretty well, right? or the friend who says, you'll be there, when I need you, right? And all this sort of thing. Anyway, there are various reasons why you sort of tell these lies, and you just don't think, oh yeah, when everything comes up, etc. And then it leads to other kinds of lies that are more important and more significant, and finally you find yourself justifying lying all the time. And Meneses says, look, you didn't start out bad. You started out good. You knew the underlying truth. It's just that life is complicated. It hits you with all sorts of things. You have desires. You have all sorts of things that, and here is his imagery, it beclouds the mind. The mind, he says, is like a mirror, and it's important to keep it clean. It gets clouded by life, and you've got to keep wiping it clean. So the great end of learning, he says, is nothing else but to seek for the lost mind. That sounds a little bit crazy, like, I've lost my mind, where is it? But actually what he's saying is desire, life, all these external influences just put a lot of fog in the mirror. And you've got to keep wiping the fog off the mirror. You've got to keep that attachment to your child's heart, to that mind that you're in danger of losing, that mind that does know the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. Now, on the other side of things, Shunzi gives arguments that the nature of human beings is actually evil. In fact, something that is repeated throughout his text on this is the nature of man is evil. The good which it shows is factitious, which is an old-fashioned word for artificial. Okay? It's something that is the product of artifice. It is developed. And so, in saying it's artificial, or that it's an artifact, he's not saying, oh, it's fake. But he is saying it's something that was built, constructed specifically. This building wasn't just naturally here. It's not like explorers came here and said, whoa, look at Burdine Hall. What a cool thing. We have classes in it. It's something we built, right? And that doesn't imply anything about whether it's good or bad. It's just a human construction. And so what he's saying here is that goodness is a human construction. It's not something that's natural to us. It is something we create. We build it. Now, how do we do it? Well, he says, here's what's innate to us. It's actually self-interest, desire for gain, envy, dislike. He sounds a lot here like St. Augustine, who begins the Confessions by saying, I've got to confess all those sins I committed as a baby. I don't remember what they are, but I've seen babies and I know I was a lot like them. And what are babies like? Essentially says they're evil. What do you mean they're evil? Well, they're selfish, okay? The baby just thinks, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I got gas, I'm sleepy. It's all me, right? And we have to be taught to care about other people. It doesn't come naturally to us. So he says, look at a baby. You don't see a lot of self-denial there. You don't see a lot of yielding to others, or faith, or righteousness, or propriety. Instead, you see selfishness. That's what's natural to us. And so those other things, self-denial, yielding to others, faith, righteousness, propriety, in general, right action, those are things that have to be developed. They aren't just there to be found naturally. He says, so we need teachers, we need laws. Then human nature can become correct. We are like, well, we have this tendency to grow like weeds, you might say, and we have to be shaped into a plant that has a desirable shape. That doesn't come naturally to us. So, he says, there is a difference between a capacity, something we could become, and a tendency, something that in the absence of external influences we tend to become. He says we have the capacity to be virtuous, we have the capacity to be good, but we have the tendency to be bad. Left to our own devices, we look after ourselves. And it takes work to be good. It takes effort, it takes consciousness. Now, after a while, it can start seeming easy because that sort of work becomes like second nature to us. And Aristotle will talk about virtue in exactly those terms. Virtue is a habit that becomes second nature. We no longer have to think about it consciously, we just naturally do it. But Xunzi would say, well, not exactly naturally. Second nature, not first nature. It's something that we've gotten so much into the habit of doing that it feels natural to us, but in fact it was an artifact, something that was the result of training, of education, of upbringing, of all sorts of things. So he says to become a good person, that does require training, education. You've got to have good teachers, good parents who show you how to live. You've got to have good friends, you've got to exercise self-control. You have to practice. Okay, and so in the end he says all is the influence of association. What he means is everything good about human beings is the result of us influencing each other. If we were just left to our own devices and acting entirely naturally, it would be very bad. We would be like animals. I used to feed raccoons when I lived in an apartment here. I had a balcony, raccoons would climb up onto it, and I would toss them dog food. And when you have one raccoon on the balcony and you're feeding it dog food, it's very cute. They go like this, and they pretend like they're watching their food, and then they eat it and they're like little bears, and it's kind of awesome. And I found that when Europeans came to visit, they loved this because the raccoon's a real rarity in Europe. I mean, they're not natural to Europe, they're only found in zoos. So from our point of view, it would be like having, feeding lemurs or something. It was quite exotic. However, you get a couple of raccoons, and you got to give them separate piles of food. But if you do this long enough, I can tell you, you end up with dozens of raccoons. And then, what happens? Do you observe a lot of self-control? Do you observe a lot of propriety? Well, your turn first. Oh no, you. No, it isn't like that at all. There's a huge amount of snarling and they'll still do this. They eat it, but it's really awesome. And so, basically, Xunzi is saying that's what humanity would be like, except that we influence each other toward the good. Okay, so everything is really the influence of people on us trying to make us better. Well, as I mentioned, Confucius tries to do everything without taking a position here. And so let's start with what is the question he seems to devote the most time to. The question, what kind of person should I be? Okay, and his answer is, a person of red, a person who exhibits virtue, who is benevolent. And there are certain characteristic virtues that are associated with this. Almost any virtue theorist has to tell you what are the central virtues. You could say, look, just develop a good character and what's involved in that. And then it would turn out there are lots and lots of traits that are desirable. So, for example, what are some traits that you think it would be important to have yourself or having a good friend? What are good traits of character you would look for in a friend that you would try to develop in yourself? Yeah. Honesty, good. You would want to be honest. You'd want your friends to be honest. Other traits, yes. Empathy, good. You'd want them to empathize, to be able to understand how other people are thinking and feeling. Yeah. Loyalty, yes. You'd want your friends to be loyal, and you would want yourself to be a loyal friend to others. Yes. Consistency. Yeah, you want to be consistent. You want to look at traumatic friends. You don't want a friend who is really friendly and happy one day, and then the next day it's like, get away from me. Hey, you. Okay? And so you want people who are fairly predictable. Yeah. Good. You want people who are not selfish. You want people who are maybe not so far as selfless, but nevertheless are willing to do things for other people. And so are not selfish, who are altruistic and want to do kind things for others. Yes? Yeah. Humility, good. People who are humble. Someone who is always boasting gets obnoxious as a friend, and you wouldn't want yourself to be always boasting. So humility is a good quality. Yes? Patience. Okay, good. You'd want to be patient. You'd want other people around you to be patient. Now, we've just started listing these, and you might imagine we could go on for a long time. Actually, once I did this as an exercise, I just said, I'm going to sit down and write down as many of these terms as I can for virtues. And I stopped after about 45 minutes when I had 250. And I realized, yeah, I could just keep going and going and going. And all of that's just within English. There are all sorts of other languages that have terms for virtues that we don't have in English. And so I started realizing, yes, it's a vast field. And so you could, I guess, have a theory of virtue that says, we're going to identify the following 500 components of a good person. But that's probably not all that useful. Almost all virtue theorists say, here are some key virtues. Here are some things that I think are fundamental. And Confucius does the same thing. He says, to be able to practice 5 things everywhere under heaven constitutes perfect virtue. So what are these 5 things? First of all, seriousness. The good person is to be a serious person. Secondly, generosity. The good person is generous. Third, the good person is sincere. Fourth, they are diligent. They work hard. And finally, kindness. The good person is kind. There are other virtues that Confucius talks about and that later Confucians talk about, but those are the 5 that are singled out as in some way the most central, in some way the most important. So, let's talk about those a little bit. Seriousness. Why is seriousness a virtue? Yeah?
I guess you don't want someone who's going to like mislead you or not be honest, I suppose.
Okay, yeah. Suppose somebody is really not serious. They're constantly goofing off, okay? That could be fun. That person might be attractive to hang around with for a while, but eventually that's not going to be very satisfying. Partly because this may lead them to be dishonest, but it might also be just because they're not going to take you seriously either. You might say, wow, I'm really facing this problem. Hey, make some joke about it. No, this isn't a joke. This is serious. So there is a certain level of seriousness that's required for friendship, that's required in general to be a good person. Yeah?
Also, they're not dismissive of serious subjects.
Good, not dismissive of serious subjects. Yes, there can be fun in life. Confucius is sometimes derided as somebody who doesn't find a place for fun, but that's not true. In fact, as we'll see, all of these virtues are means between extremes. And so, on the one hand, the serious person is not clownish. They don't just dismiss things. They take things seriously when they ought to be taken seriously. But on the other hand, Confucius says, you can go too far. You can be serious all the time. You can just have no sense of humor. You can become somber, is the way his term for this is usually translated. And that's not good either. The serious person is one who takes seriously what ought to be taken seriously. Okay? So you don't want to be a total goof-off, but on the other hand, you don't want to be somebody who is constantly taking everything serious. Be neither Bart nor Lisa Simpson. Okay? There's somewhere in between that is actually the appropriate way to behave. And the same thing with generosity. Sincerity, diligence, and kindness. Those are means between extremes. So, yes, well, I've already talked about that. This is the kind of person we want to become. So here's in general how that looks. The person who is sort of right with respect to seriousness, he calls serious. The person who isn't serious enough is basically frivolous. The person who has too much of this trait is somber. But what about generosity? Well, if you have too little of that, you're stingy. But can you be too generous? What would it be like to be too generous?
You wouldn't have anything for yourself.
That's right, you wouldn't really have anything for yourself. And so the term for that is often translated as profligate. Imagine a person who, there's a guy on the street corner who says, out of work, can you help? And you say, oh man, sure. Here, take my car. And here are the keys to my house. And this lets you into my office. There's a cool computer there. You can steal it. No, that's not generosity. That's going too far. That's something else. Now, the same thing is true of sincerity. Some Confucians will say that sincerity is really the most fundamental of the 5 fundamental virtues. But it too you can go too far. You can be insincere, of course. That's not having enough of this quality. But if you have too much of it, he says you become reckless. Okay? The person who will, for example, tell the truth no matter what. That, he says, isn't just honesty. The honest person tells the truth when they ought to tell the truth. But you can be too honest. What are some examples of that? Where it would be reckless to tell the truth.
Tells you a secret, and they ask you not to tell anyone.
Excellent. Somebody tells you a secret, and they say, but don't tell anyone. And then somebody says, so what's going on with Joe there? And he's like, oh, he told me this secret. It's really cool. Right? That's not just sincerity. That's going beyond that to recklessness. Diligence. Well, the opposite of that in a sense is laziness, not working hard. But you can be somebody who works too much. And that person is dull. At least that's what I've said there on the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy principle. But it is possible to be a workaholic, to work too much. Now, kind, well, it's easy to imagine someone who is unkind or mean, but you could be too kind. What would it mean to be too kind? To be indulgent? To be a pushover, exactly. The virtuous person is not a pushover. And in fact, at one point, somebody says to Confucius, the superior person, if somebody fell down into a well, I guess the superior person would go down and go into the well after them. And Confucius says, basically, the superior person is kind and is generous, but they're not an idiot, okay? If they can help the person get out of the well, then sure. But if they're just going to be stuck down in the well too, then no. Okay, so there's such a thing as being too kind. Oh, you're in the well and stuck and can't get out? I'll jump down and keep you company. That is not what the superior person has to do. Now, here is one thing to find that's interesting. What about Ren itself? What about virtue itself? You can obviously be not virtuous, and he calls that being small-minded. But can you be too virtuous? Can you be too good? His answer is actually yes. You can be too moral. Okay? And his term for that is simple. You can be simple. You can actually be too moral. You can be too good. Why? Well, what would it be like to be too virtuous? Yeah.
What if you lose a sense of self? If you're just trying to fit into some frame?
Okay, good. Maybe you completely lose a sense of self. And that's not a good thing. The superior person doesn't completely lose a sense of self. So that's part of it. Can you think of anything else that would be too virtuous? Yeah.
So, in prison, when Meneses was that idea where he's too virtuous because, when he's asked about how to repay someone who lacks kindness versus cause injury, and he says to do so with kindness, well, in the same way Confucius is, still intelligent while being virtuous, it says to still repay them with justice.
Good. Yes, a question arises here and really in every philosophical tradition. How do you correct injustices? What if somebody acts harmfully to you? Somebody walks up to you and suddenly, utterly unprovoked, punches you. Okay? Now, what do? Well, here's one answer, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Punch them back. Assuming you can get up after the punch. Okay? Here's another answer. Turn the other cheek. Okay? Respond with kindness. Confucius says, wait a minute. Should you respond to injury with kindness? How then will you respond to kindness? He basically says, look, in response to kindness, show kindness. In response to injury, seek justice. And so you might say, do you punch back? Do you forgive? His answer is roughly, you call the police, okay? Seek justice. We will later see the same issue arise in the Taoists, where they say you respond with Dei, with your own inner virtue, which really means you respond spontaneously. Sometimes you punch back, sometimes you forgive, sometimes you call the police, and really in the end it comes down to your own spontaneous reaction that is the best guide to what you ought to do. It's going to vary with situation, but Confucius doesn't say that. He says seek justice. But the person who would be maybe too virtuous is the person who wouldn't do that, who wouldn't respond in that sort of way to protect themselves. Well, there are other virtues Confucius talks about. The superior person is respectful, is cautious, is straightforward, and is strong. All of those are important moral virtues, he thinks. But again, you can go too far with respect to all of those. Yes, don't be devious, but on the other hand, don't be so straightforward that you're rude. Be strong, but not so strong that you're just extravagant. You want to be strong, but you don't necessarily want to be, You should not be careless, but on the other hand, don't be so cautious that you're timid. And finally, yes, be respectful, don't be disrespectful toward others, but on the other hand, you can be too respectful. You can be, well, just a busybody who is too bustling. My own mother-in-law was actually a bit like that. She was very solicitous of other people's wants and desires. She tried to make everybody else feel comfortable and feel at home, but she did so much of it, it was actually annoying. You know, you'd get there and she'd say, "Can I get you something?" I actually can't imitate her accent. It's this wonderful New England, New Hampshire accent. You know, "Can I get you something to drink?" No, I'm fine." "Are you sure?" Yes, I'm good." A moment later, "You sure you don't want a cup?" "Yeah, I'm good." "How about a cup of coffee?" "No, really, it's fine." "Some tea, I can make some tea." It's like, shut up! I mean, she was very respectful to the point of being just sort of, well, someone who would drive you crazy. And why? She sort of went too far in that direction of being solicitous of other people's desires. She was, if you can be this way, too nice. Now, I want to close today. We'll continue talking about Confucius some next time. But I want to close today by pointing out something very important that we might have to save an extensive discussion for next time. And that is that different virtues pertain to different relationships. A few years ago, I was asked to give a talk on Father's Day about what Western philosophers had to say about fathers. And I said, I can't do it. They have nothing to say about fathers. And it's not a sexist thing. They have nothing to say about mothers either. They really have nothing to say about family relationships. Western philosophers don't care what the relationship between you and another person is. There's just you and somebody else, and that's it. Now, Confucius thinks that's crazy. There are all sorts of things your parents do for you that they don't do for just anyone. And if you become a parent, there are going to be all sorts of things you're willing to do for your children that you don't do for other people. Like, what are some examples? Things your parents do for you that they wouldn't do just for an arbitrary person. Yeah.
Help pay for college.
Help pay for college. Yeah, exactly. When it was time for my kids to go to college, I paid for it. I didn't just say, well, I've got this money and I could pay somebody's tuition. I guess I should just find out who the most deserving student is and create a scholarship in their name. And you, my daughter, you can compete for it just like anybody else. Did I do that? No. I didn't do that. And Confucius says, well, of course it was right for you not to do that. People in a certain special relationship with you have certain special rights, certain special responsibilities, certain special obligations.